Tonight we delve into the world of ancient Greece, a place renowned for its contributions to philosophy, democracy, and its statues that seemed to defy the need for pants. However, beyond the tales of Plato, Sparta, and the grand temples, there's a harsher reality. While ancient Greece laid the foundation for Western civilization, it also presented its average citizens with daily challenges that would be nearly insurmountable by today's standards. Before we get too comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you truly enjoy the content here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always interesting to see the global audience joining us. Now, let's set the mood by dimming the lights, maybe turning on a fan for some background noise, and begin our journey together. Welcome to ancient Greece, where your day starts not with an alarm clock, but with the sun turning your house into a slow cooking oven. Your dwelling is simple, constructed from sun-dried mud bricks or coarse stone, featuring small windows without glass, only wooden shutters to keep out the goats and perhaps allow a breeze if the gods are kind. There's no insulation, no fan, and no personal space, unless you consider the spot where the family goat doesn't sleep. You wake up early not out of discipline, but because the heat is already unbearable. In summer, the stone walls soak up the heat like a sponge, and by sunrise, your house is radiating it back at you. In winter, those same walls become freezing cold, and you're huddled under a sheet, hoping to avoid frostbite. You likely slept on a thin mat or a mattress filled with straw, with no pillows, just a rolled up cloak or your arm for support. If you're fortunate, the lice didn't bother you last night. But probably they did. There's no running water in your home. Your morning routine starts with a walk to the public fountain. Or if you live in the countryside, a trip to the nearby well to fetch water. You carry the water in clay jars balanced on your shoulders, hoping you don't stumble and drop them, causing a week's worth of back pain. You don't bathe in the morning. That's something you might do at the end of the day, if you have the time. Instead, you might splash some water on your face, rub olive oil onto your skin, and then scrape it off with a stridle, a curved metal blade. It's like a spa day, but without the spa, the leisure, or any real effectiveness. And forget about privacy. Your entire family lives in one room. You sleep, eat, and argue together, often over who brought in mud from the street. The street is your hallway, your news source, and your trash dump. You haven't even eaten yet, but your back already hurts. You're sweating, and your tunic is sticking in uncomfortable places. And this is supposed to be the best part of your day. So, having survived the sweltering Greek bedroom, it's time to get some food, right? Welcome to breakfast in ancient Greece. A meal so sparse that it makes modern intermittent fasting seem like a feast. Your first taste of the day is barley bread, stale, dense, and as unexciting as the dirt it was baked beside. This is maza, made from barley flour mixed with water, shaped into flat cakes and baked on hot stones or in the ashes of last night's fire. Imagine an ancient granola bar, but without any sweetness, texture, or joy. You might dip it in watered, down wine because, surprise, the water isn't always safe to drink. There's no filtration system, no boiling, no pitcher of clean water in your clay pantry. So, everyone from kids to elders gets a cup of wine mixed with water. Not for the buzz, but for survival. If you're wealthy, you might get a fig or two, some olives, or a bit of goat cheese. But let's be honest, you're not wealthy. You're lucky if your bread isn't covered in yesterday's flies and doesn't crack your tooth when you bite into it. No coffee, no eggs, no fruit bowl, no honey, unless you live near a decent beekeeper and know how to bribe them. And don't expect to sit and relax. Meals are quick. No chairs, no forks, and certainly no mindful eating. You chew, you nod, and you get back to work. Oh, and if you're a woman, you don't even eat with the men. In many households, women and children eat separately, often after the males have finished. So not only is the food bad, but you also have to wait your turn to be disappointed. The irony is that the ancient Greeks are the same people who gave us symposiums, banquets, and poetic odes to wine. But breakfast, that's not worth a line of verse. It's utilitarian, dry, often literally burnt, and yet you chew through it like a champion because it's the only thing standing between you and a full day of sun, labour, and arguing philosophers. Enjoy your meal. Just try not to crack a tooth. Now that you've managed to swallow your stale barley bread and a gulp of diluted wine, it's time to freshen up, or, more precisely, attempt to. In ancient Greece, hygiene was less about being clean and more about following rituals and using oil. Soap was something for future generations to enjoy. Your morning routine typically involved pouring cold water over yourself at the public fountain or courtyard basin. Unless you were fortunate enough to live near a bathhouse, which most people didn't, there were no shampoos, no scented body washes, and no sponges unless you had stolen one from a sponge diver in the Aegean. Instead, you relied on olive oil. You rubbed it into your skin, not to moisturize, but to gather dirt and sweat. Then you scraped it off with a strigil, a curved bronze blade that left you somewhat less greasy, but still questionable. Picture smearing yourself with salad dressing and then scraping it off. That was your skincare routine. And if you thought that sounded appealing, remember everyone else was doing the same, often in communal, loud, and naked settings. Hygiene was a social affair in ancient Greece. Privacy was a luxury. Now, let's talk about dental care. There were no toothbrushes or toothpaste. Maybe you rubbed your gums with crushed charcoal or rinsed with vinegar if you were feeling fancy, but mostly you chewed on a twig and hoped for the best. Dental hygiene was more a matter of divine mercy than routine care. Body odour was everywhere. Deodorant didn't exist, but perfumes were available for those who could afford them. So, you might dab a bit of myrrh or rose oil on your neck before walking 5 miles in sandals through the Athenian heat. The result was a uniquely Greek mix of musk, dust, and desperation. Laundry was infrequent. Clothes were cleaned by beating them against stones in the river. If you were poor, your tunic probably hadn't been washed since the last festival. In short, hygiene in ancient Greece wasn't about looking or smelling good. It was about appearing slightly less unpleasant than the day before. The oil and scrape method helped, but only so much when you were sweating in a tunic under a sun that seemed determined to bake you. Now that you've managed to clean yourself with oil and a scraper, it's time to get dressed. But don't get too excited. Your ancient Greek wardrobe is pretty basic and not very practical. You have 2 main options, a chiton or a himation. Both are essentially large rectangles of linen that you wrap around yourself and fasten with a brooch or tie with a belt. They aren't tailored or fitted, and they definitely weren't designed for windy days. One gust of wind and your philosophical thoughts might be on full display. Underwear doesn't exist, and neither do bras. Unless you're a Spartan woman trained for physical activities, you're just hoping your pins hold and no one notices your wardrobe shifting around. Moving on to footwear, if you're lucky, you have a pair of leather sandals. If not, you're walking barefoot on sun-baked stones, dirt trodden by goats, and whatever else is on the market roads. Imagine walking on a hot skillet in July while avoiding donkey dung. That's your daily walk. There's no sun protection, no hats unless you're a farmer or sailor, and definitely no sunscreen because it's 450 BCE and science hasn't been invented yet. The Hygiene sun doesn't care how philosophical you are. It will still give you a sunburn. By noon, your shoulders are red, your feet are dirty, and your linen robe is sticking to you in awkward places. And remember, public nudity isn't a big deal in Greek society. You might see men training naked at the gymnasium or politicians giving speeches in barely their togas. If you're wealthy, your tunic might be dyed in soft purple or saffron yellow, but most people wear off white or brown because dyes are expensive and not many people want to waste good colour on a fishnet mender. So, you spend your day looking like a toga burrito, sunburned, sweaty, and hoping your pin doesn't come undone in front of the priestess. And the worst part. You're only halfway through your daily chores. Welcome to ancient Greece, where military service isn't just a job. It's your civic duty, a social expectation, and sometimes a one-way ticket to an early grave. If you're a free male citizen, especially in Athens or Sparta, you're automatically a soldier, whether you like it or not. By your teenage years, you're already training with wooden weapons and learning battle formations in the phalanx. This is the famous Greek strategy where soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder behind large shields, hoping the guy next to you doesn't trip. In Sparta, boys start military training at age 7 through the brutal agoge system, which turns children into warriors by starving, whipping, and isolating them until only the toughest survive. In Athens, it's a bit gentler, but still mandatory. 2 years of training in your late teens, followed by decades of being on call. You don't get to say, I'm more of a thinker. Even philosophers like Socrates fought in wars, not with witty comebacks, but with real weapons. And there's always a war, whether it's Sparta versus Athens, Athens versus Persia, Sparta versus everyone else, or just a neighbouring city, state arguing over trade routes. Conflict is a way of life. Peace is just the pause between invasions. If you can afford it, you get a bronze helmet, breastplate, graves, a round hoplite shield, and a spear. If you can't, well, try not to be in the front row. Leather and cloth don't stop arrows. The worst part, you supply your own gear. Being a soldier is a bring-your-own-bronze situation. Poorer citizens either beg, borrow, or fight lightly armed, which usually means they're more likely to die first. When you're not fighting, you're preparing, training, cleaning weapons, arguing in the assembly about strategy, or rowing warships for hours as part of the navy. Those triremes don't paddle themselves. There's no veterans' health care, no pensions, no therapy. Just scars, limps, and the occasional poorly carved gravestone praising your virtue and courage. If you think life as a man in ancient Greece sounds tough, just wait until you hear about being a woman. In most Greek states, particularly Athens, women had fewer rights than a collection of decorative urns. You couldn't vote, hold office, own land outright, and rarely appeared in public without a male escort. In fact, if people saw you out too often, they might start whispering that you were a courtesan, or worse, a Spartan. Let's start with your daily routine. You wake up before sunrise to begin your chores. You spin wool, weave cloth, grind grain, fetch water, bake bread, manage the slaves if your household has any, and raise the children. You're the household CEO, but without pay, respect, or days off. Your social life is limited. You don't attend plays. You don't join philosophical debates. You're not at the gymnasium. That's for naked men only. You're confined mostly to the gyneconitis, the women's quarters, and your contact with the outside world consists of glimpses through latticework windows. Education. If you're lucky, you might learn to read a bit, but mostly you're trained in domestic duties. Philosophy, rhetoric, geometry. That's for the boys. Your job is to marry well, have sons, and stay invisible while doing it. Marriage happens young, often in your early teens, to a man twice your age, arranged by your father, who treats you more like a trade agreement than a person. Love is optional. Dowries are mandatory, and when you do have children, your primary value becomes your womb. Now, Sparta was the exception. Spartan women were famously more liberated. They were educated, exercised in public, and could own property. But before you envy them too much, remember their freedom came from a state-sponsored obsession with warfare and eugenics. Your main job as a Spartan woman was to give birth to strong warriors or face disgrace. And if your husband dies, you can't inherit much. You can't remarry without permission, and your options shrink faster than your social circle. You're stuck legally, socially, and often physically. So yes, the Greeks worshipped powerful goddesses like Athena, Artemis, and Hera, but real women were expected to stay quiet, stay home, and stay out of sight. Ancient Athens is celebrated as the cradle of democracy. Technically, this is accurate. However, it's important to note that most people living in Athens were excluded from participating in this democracy. To vote in the Athenian ecclesia assembly, you had to be a male citizen over 18, born to Athenian parents. This meant that women, foreigners, metics, slaves, and children, about 90% of the population, had no say in the political process. It was a democracy, but only for a select group of sunburned men in sandals. If you qualified, though, you were expected to be actively involved. Laws were proposed, debated, and passed in large assemblies of thousands of citizens. There were no professional politicians. Every eligible man was a legislator, a jury member, and an amateur enthusiast. You could even be randomly selected to hold powerful positions, like managing the treasury or serving on a jury, through a lottery system. This sounds exciting until you realize there were no qualifications for these roles. Your local fishmonger might be in charge of military logistics one day, or your uncle, who still believes in sea monsters, might be judging a murder trial the next. If someone became too powerful, too popular, or simply annoyed people, they could be ostracized. Once a year, citizens could write a name on a broken piece of pottery, called an ostracon, and vote to exile that person for 10 years. There was no trial or defense. you just had to leave. Despite its flaws, Athenian democracy was groundbreaking. It gave some ordinary men a voice and set the stage for future political systems, but it was far from fair or inclusive. Women, foreign-born taxpayers, slaves working on the Parthenon, and philosophers who asked too many questions were all silenced. Democracy was born in ancient Greece, but if you expected equal rights and inclusive politics, you'd be shown the door and told to bring your own ostracon. In ancient Greece, slavery wasn't just accepted, it was expected. Even modest households had at least one slave, not necessarily because the family was wealthy, but because slavery was so deeply ingrained in society that it felt as normal as wearing sandals or getting sunburned. The idea of not owning another human being was practically unthinkable. Slaves came from various backgrounds and were not limited to a specific race or ethnicity. They were from conquered lands such as Thrace, Caria, Syria, and even fellow Greeks from the wrong city, state at the wrong time. Some were born into slavery, others were prisoners of war, and a few were kidnapped and sold. It was a thriving, brutal market where business was always booming. In Athens, your slave likely did everything for you: cooking meals, fetching water, cleaning the home, caring for children, carrying shopping, and standing silently during dinner. Some even managed business affairs or ran the household while the owner lounged at the symposium, sipping diluted wine and discussing abstract concepts like justice. The irony was palpable. In the silver mines of Lorien, slaves, including children, worked in horrifying conditions, crawling through narrow, dark shafts, inhaling toxic dust, and slowly dying for the sake of coins and civic pride. Some slaves were educated and taught grammar and math, served as scribes, or managed bank accounts. But they were still property, subject to being beaten, branded, sold, or killed on a whim, with no legal rights. The few who gained freedom, known as freedmen, were never truly free. They still owed loyalty to their former masters and were denied citizenship, unable to vote or own land, with only the hope of a slightly better future. Unlike later slave systems, there was no widespread abolitionist movement in ancient Greece. Philosophers like Aristotle justified slavery as natural and necessary, arguing that some people were inherently meant to be slaves. Ancient Greece gave us ethics, democracy, and philosophy, but all of these achievements were built on the backs of people who were never allowed to speak, vote, or truly matter. This is not a minor detail, it's the very foundation of their society. Feeling unwell in ancient Greece. That's unfortunate, because unless you live next door to Hippocrates himself, your healthcare plan includes some vague herbs, divine intervention, and a lot of wishful thinking. Let's start with the basics. There are no hospitals as we know them. If you're sick or injured, you stay home. Maybe a neighbour knows a thing or two about poultices. Maybe a relative remembers a prayer to Asclepius, the god of healing. Maybe your local temple has a snake you can pet for spiritual comfort. That's about it. The most famous Greek doctors were really a mix of herbalist, philosopher, and gambler. They believed in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to them, illness was caused by an imbalance in these fluids. So if you had a fever, too much blood, time to drain it. Coughing, too much phlegm, try fasting. Melancholy, that's black bile. Maybe take a walk or stare at the sea dramatically. Most treatments were based on trial, error, and garlic. You might be given crushed poppy seeds. Good luck with that. Boiled figs or a compress made of vinegar and something someone scraped off a goat. Did it work sometimes? Did it hurt? Almost always. Surgery, rare, terrifying, and generally a last resort. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, even a simple cut could go septic and kill you. Tools included iron knives, bone saws, and prayers. Lots of prayers. And if you needed something amputated, hope you brought a leather strap to bite down on. Midwives handled childbirth, which was dangerous even on the best days. Mortality rates for women and infants were tragically high. One bad birth, one stuck shoulder, one breech baby, and that was it. If you were wealthy, you might summon a travelling physician, someone with an actual scroll and some fancy oils. If you were poor, you relied on local knowledge, street remedies, and sheer resilience, or you simply didn't recover. But hey, at least they believed in rest, clean air, and a balanced diet. So there's that. Ancient Greek medicine gave us the Hippocratic Oath, but it also gave us treatments like drinking boiled cabbage water. So, yes, healthcare in ancient Greece, mostly herbs, hope, and hang on. In ancient Greece, theatre was more than just entertainment. It was a civic duty, a religious ritual, and sometimes a full contact sport for the soul. The good news is that theatre was free for citizens, assuming you weren't a woman, slave, or foreigner, in which case, good luck seeing anything. You'd squeeze into an enormous open, air theatre carved into a hillside, like the great theatre of Dionysus in Athens, packed shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other sweaty citizens. And you'd be there all day. The Dionysia festival ran from dawn until night with back-to-back plays, tragedies, comedies, and satyr plays. There were no intermissions, no snacks, and certainly no bathroom breaks unless you counted a bush on the hillside. If you showed up late or acted out, you weren't just frowned at, you could be fined. The performances were intense. Tragedies were emotionally gut-wrenching, filled with murder, madness, war, and gods destroying families because of one bad decision made 3 generations ago. You didn't come to laugh, you came to weep in unison. Then came the comedies, which weren't exactly light-hearted family fare. These plays mocked politicians, philosophers, entire cities, and bodily functions with stunning precision. Imagine if Saturday Night Live and a college debate had a baby, then dressed it in a giant phallic costume and sent it on stage. Actors wore towering masks, platform shoes, and exaggerated costumes, all male, of course, even for women's roles. The chorus sang, danced, and shouted commentary like an ancient Greek version of Twitter, only louder and wearing tunics. And this wasn't passive viewing. The audience was loud. They booed, hissed, threw things, and argued mid-performance. Theatre was democracy with stage lights. If the play offended you, you let them know. If it moved you, you shouted, wept, and maybe re-evaluated your life. At the end of the festival, a jury voted on which playwright won. Imagine spending 3 days crying over tragedies only to find out some bawdy comedy with a talking pig god took the prize. That's ancient Greece for you. So yes, in the theatre, you were never just watching. You were participating and possibly throwing olives. After surviving your tragic all-day theatre binge, you'd wander into the agora, the bustling heart of the city, and stumble right into a man wearing a cloak, holding no shoes, and asking strangers, What is justice? Welcome to philosophy. It's everywhere and it's not optional. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, philosophy was the local sport, and the champions were names we now associate with world-changing ideas: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Back then, though, they were just eccentric men who talked a lot and made other people feel stupid. Take Socrates. The man made a career out of asking questions that led nowhere and dismantling people's confidence in their own opinions. You might be minding your own business, buying olives or petting a stray goat, and he'd appear. Do you believe in truth? I guess. What is truth? Cue 3 hours of mental spiral and a desire to move to Sparta. He never wrote anything down. His student Plato did that. But Socrates left a lasting impression, partly because Athens eventually executed him for being too annoying. Officially, it was corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. But let's be honest, he probably just wouldn't stop asking questions during dinner. Philosophy wasn't a cozy academic hobby. It was loud, confrontational, and weirdly athletic. Debates happened in public spaces. They were spontaneous, intense, and often ended in hurt feelings or deep existential crises. No microphones, just voices, hands, and enough ego to fill the Parthenon. And if you thought you could just watch, think again. Philosophers loved drawing in random bystanders. You didn't walk past Plato's academy. You were absorbed into it. You said one thing slightly wrong, and suddenly became the day's example of an unexamined life. Even kids weren't safe. Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great, a teenager who later conquered half the known world. Imagine your high school civics teacher handing you a globe and saying, "Go fix this." So yes, philosophy gave us logic, ethics, science, and political theory. But in ancient Greece, it also gave you a headache, a crisis of identity, and a 70% chance of being publicly humiliated by a man in sandals. So, you've made it in ancient Athens. You're well-spoken, clever, politically active. People like you may be too much. That's your first mistake. Because in Athens, being too popular could get you kicked out of the city for 10 years. Not arrested, not fined, just gone. This wasn't a conspiracy or a backroom deal. It was built into the system. It was called ostracism, and it was perfectly legal, perfectly public, and perfectly terrifying. Once a year, the citizens of Athens would gather to decide whether to hold an ostracism vote. If enough people agreed, everyone wrote the name of a person they wanted exiled on a broken piece of pottery called an ostracon. If someone got 6 zeros and or more votes, they were banished. No trial, no explanation. Just pack your sandals and leave. You didn't have to be a criminal. In fact, most ostracized people had done nothing wrong except get too influential. Maybe you were a war hero, a persuasive speaker, or just had great hair. Whatever it was, your fellow citizens decided you were becoming a threat to democracy, and democracy voted to yeet you into temporary oblivion. And here's the twist. It wasn't permanent. Ostracism lasted 10 years, after which you could come back like nothing happened. Your property was untouched. Your citizenship remained. No grudges, just a decade-long vacation you didn't ask for. Some famous Athenians were ostracized. Aristides the Just was so well liked that someone allegedly voted against him just because they were sick of hearing how virtuous he was. Brutal. Even Themistocles, the military genius who saved Athens at the Battle of Salamis, got the boot once he got too cocky. Turns out gratitude has an expiration date. Ostracism was meant to protect Athens from tyrants, but it often punished success. So, if you were ambitious, you had to walk a fine line. Be respected, but not too respected. Popular, but not charismatic enough to worry people. Think of it like a reality show where the prize for winning too many fans is being exiled to the countryside with your dignity and olive oil stash. Athens gave birth to democracy, but it also invented cancel culture too, 500 years ahead of schedule. In ancient Greece, the question wasn't if you would die young, but how soon and how painfully. Life expectancy was around 30 to 35 years, and that was if you survived infancy, which many didn't. About 1 in 3 children didn't make it to adulthood due to diseases, poor nutrition, and the generally poor hygiene practices of the time. Death could come from anything. A scratch that became infected, an unexplained fever, childbirth, a major cause of death for women, or even drinking contaminated water. Medical knowledge was limited, and divine intervention was inconsistent at best. In cities, diseases spread rapidly due to cramped living conditions, open sewers, and shared water sources. The plague of Athens during the Peloponnesian War is a prime example, wiping out 1/3 of the city's population. Thucydides documented it, contracted it, and miraculously survived, but most people weren't so fortunate. War was a constant threat. If you were a man, you were likely to die in battle or while rowing a trireme. Even non-fatal injuries often became deadly later on, with no antibiotics or proper medical care, just hope and garlic compresses. There was also the ever-present threat of divine retribution. Offend a god by forgetting a sacrifice, mocking a temple statue, or speaking ill of Zeus after a few drinks, and you might face a lightning strike, a plague, or a sudden goat stampede. Proper burial was crucial. If your family couldn't afford a proper funeral with coins for the ferryman and the necessary rituals to secure your place in the afterlife, you might be left outside the city walls, unmarked and forgotten. This was not just tragic, but also spiritually perilous, as the Greeks believed that unburied souls wandered eternally, trapped between worlds. Death was a daily reality, indifferent to your philosophy, beauty, or social status. Whether you were a slave, a general, or a poet, you could die from something as trivial as a mouldy fig or an angry mosquito. The 12 Olympian gods were not on your side. In theory, ancient Greek religion was about achieving harmony with the divine, worshipping gods like Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, and the rest of the Olympian pantheon. In practice, it was more like constant spiritual damage control. These gods were not peaceful or all-loving, they were dramatic and temperamental, wielding their powers capriciously. If you forgot a sacrifice, they might ruin your crops. If you said the wrong prayer, your ship could sink. Step into the wrong grove, and you might face a snake bite, plague, or famine. The gods demanded not just loyalty, but also perfect timing, flawless rituals, and unwavering obedience. Daily rituals, home altars, seasonal festivals, and civic ceremonies were all part of life. Before planting crops, you prayed to Demeter. Before going to war, you offered to Ares. Before travelling by sea, you made sure to pour wine to Poseidon and maybe even sacrifice a goat for good measure. Each god had their favourites and grudges. Apollo might protect your city unless your grandfather had once offended him, in which case you were cursed indefinitely. Hera, the goddess of marriage, was known for making mortal women's lives miserable if Zeus so much as glanced at them. Athena rewarded wisdom, but could also turn people into spiders on a whim. And if the Olympians weren't enough to keep you on edge, there were nymphs, satyrs, spirits, river gods, and monsters lurking everywhere. Step on the wrong patch of sacred land, and a vengeful woodland sprite might claim your leg. Worst of all, you never knew why something bad happened. Was it the wrong offering, the wrong timing, or an insult to a god in a dream? Maybe it was something your cousin did, or even your great-grandfather. The gods worked in mysterious and deeply personal ways. Despite the fear, Greek religion was deeply intertwined with every aspect of life, from politics to childbirth to the Olympic Games. You feared the gods, but you also depended on them. Their temples were landmarks, their festivals were holidays, and their myths explained everything from natural phenomena to human emotions. Belief wasn't a matter of faith, it was a matter of survival. So, considering everything, the sun-baked homes, the barley bread breakfasts, the sandal-blistered feet, the wars, plagues, gods, and goat-related traumas, would you last a single day in ancient Greece? Honestly, probably not. The heat, the diet, and the constant threats of war or divine punishment would quickly dispel any romantic notions of living in ancient times. You're not used to fetching water before breakfast or using a hole in the ground next to a temple goat. You'd miss modern conveniences like running water, aspirin, and the freedom to complain without fear of exile. The idea of living among marble statues, brilliant philosophers, and epic poets is appealing, but that was the reality for only a tiny fraction of ancient Greece. For most people, life was hard labour, limited rights, and frequent loss. Democracy was only for male citizens, medicine was rudimentary, the gods were often angry, and social media was a guy in the agora yelling about justice while waving a fish. Despite all this, the Greeks endured. They built temples that still stand, wrote plays we still perform, debated ideas we still grapple with, and laid the groundwork for fields like astronomy and ethics. They didn't just survive, they thrived amidst chaos. They questioned everything, fought constantly, wrote beautifully, died young, and still managed to shape the modern world. You probably wouldn't survive your first sunstroke, goat bite, or unsolicited philosophy lesson. But if you did, you'd find yourself among some of the most passionate, resilient, and flawed people in history. They wouldn't judge you for struggling. They'd just hand you a tunic, point to the Acropolis, and say, "Good. Now carry that up a hill." It all began with a death and a betrayal. Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England, had skillfully navigated the Roman political landscape. He had wealth, autonomy, and peace as long as he remained useful to the empire. But when he died around 60 AD, he left a will naming the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his two young daughters, hoping this gesture would protect his people. He was wrong. Rome ignored the will, annexed the Iceni kingdom, and took everything. But the worst was yet to come. The Romans publicly flogged Queen Boudica and violated her daughters in front of her. This was not just a political move, it was psychological warfare meant to break the spirit of the Iceni people. But instead of breaking her, it ignited a fire within Boudica. Rome had crushed a minor tribal woman beneath its boot, but in doing so, they had awakened a lioness. a queen who would turn her pain into vengeance, a mother whose rage would set cities ablaze, a woman who would remind Rome that even empires could bleed. The news of the Roman atrocities spread rapidly across Britannia. Other tribes listened and remembered their own humiliations, land losses, and sons killed in Roman campaigns. Rome had assumed the tribes were divided and scattered, but in that moment they shared a common cause: Boudica's fury. What began with Rome's violation of one queen would soon escalate into a revolt that would make the empire tremble. Rome had broken a treaty, a family, and the illusion of its own invincibility in Britannia. This was not just a mistake, it was the spark that ignited one of the most ferocious revolts Rome ever faced. If Rome thought Boudica would fade into silence, they had gravely misunderstood her. Boudica was not born to obey, she was born to lead. Described by Roman historians as tall, fierce, with flaming red hair cascading down to her waist, and a voice that could pierce through crowds like a war horn. She was more than just a queen by blood, she was a symbol, and now a formidable threat. But before she became a threat to Rome, she became something deeper, a mother with nothing left to lose. Roman brutality had tried to erase her dignity, her children's future, and her people's pride, but Boudica refused to be a victim. She understood that what Rome feared most was not an army, but unity, so she began to forge alliances, one tribe at a time. First, the Trinovantes, who had once been powerful before Rome crushed them with taxes, land seizures, and slave labour. When Boudica spoke, she spoke not as a diplomat, but as a warrior mother, scarred but unbroken. She reminded them of their ancestors, their gods, and the land they had lost. Her pain became their pain, her rage became theirs. Then other tribes began to listen: the Corytani, the Cativaloni, the Brigantates. Her cause was no longer about vengeance. It became a holy mission to cleanse Britannia of Roman arrogance. She promised not safety, but glory and honourable death, if necessary. They followed her because she did not stand behind her warriors. She rode among them, spear in hand, hair loose in the wind, eyes fixed on the future. She called out the names of the raped, the enslaved, the executed, and summoned gods like Andraste, the Celtic war goddess, as her witness. Her warriors believed that the gods would fight alongside them. Boudica had no formal military training or Roman strategy scrolls, but she had something more powerful: righteous fury sharpened by betrayal and guided by purpose. The land itself seemed to shift under her command. This was not just a rebellion, it was a resurrection. The Queen Rome thought it had broken was now leading a movement that would soon make the empire tremble. The Roman eagle had long soared over Britannia, but now the winds beneath its wings were changing. Boudica's fury was not a wildfire, it was a storm building with terrifying purpose. This storm needed fuel, and that fuel came from the thousands of Britons who had waited for generations for someone to defy the empire, to speak not in Latin, but in blood and iron. She gave them that voice. It started with war councils held under sacred groves and moonlit hills. Boudica did not sit on a throne. She stood in the dirt with her people, listening to the anger of tribal elders, the sorrow of mothers, and the chants of druids who saw omens in the sky. They all spoke of one truth: Rome had pushed too far. Now it was time to push back. Warriors from the Trinovantes brought spears, slings, and ancient battle chants. The Iceni added cavalry, swift riders with wild hair and war paint, fierce and fearless. Other tribes joined with axes, blades, and torches. Even women took up arms, inspired by their queen. This was not just an army forming, it was a resurrection of Celtic identity. But Rome had trained legions, professional soldiers, armoured, disciplined, and lethal. Boudica had to make up for that with numbers, knowledge of the land, and something Rome could never teach, hatred forged in humiliation. Soon Boudica's army swelled to tens of thousands. Farmers became warriors, hunters became assassins, former Roman slaves and mistreated tribal allies switched sides. These were not soldiers who fought for pay, they fought for memory, revenge, and the right to raise children without chains. She gave a speech, her first of many. Roman historians would later record her words, albeit with their bias. But what echoes through time is clear: she vowed to win or die. There would be no surrender, no submission, no turning back. Her first target was Camulodunum. Once a British stronghold, it was now a Roman colony filled with temples, statues, and villas. The Temple of Claudia stood as an insult, a shrine to the emperor who had conquered them. To Boudica and her warriors, it was not sacred. It was a provocation and the first target. The tribes were no longer whispering rebellion. They were marching, armed with fury, led by a queen who refused to kneel. Camulodunum never stood a chance. The once proud Roman colony had become a symbol of everything Boudica's people despised. Its streets echoed with Latin commands. Its buildings rose on sacred ground, and towering over it all was the Temple of Claudius, a marble mockery built with forced labour, praising the emperor who had subjugated the Britons. To Rome, it was a monument. To Boudica, it was a target. She gave the order. What followed was not a siege, but an execution. Her army descended like a tidal wave. Roman settlers, many of them veterans who had bullied and taxed the local tribes, were caught off guard. The city had no proper walls. The few Roman soldiers stationed there were poorly prepared, expecting peace, not war. They tried to hold the temple, barricading themselves inside, believing it could endure a siege. It didn't. Within 2 days, Boudica's forces breached it. The streets ran red. They spared no one. Men, women, and children were slaughtered. Boudica's war was not just military, it was personal. Her warriors destroyed Roman statues, burned villas, and turned their rage onto the very symbols of occupation. The temple was set ablaze, its roof collapsing in a firestorm that lit the sky for miles. Survivors were rare, and those who did escape carried tales of horror that chilled Roman blood. The fury was not random, it was deliberate. These were people who had seen their homes taken, their gods mocked, their daughters sold. Now they were reclaiming what had been stolen with interest. Roman officials sent pleas for help to Governor Suetonius, who was hundreds of miles away in Wales, suppressing another rebellion. But by the time he heard of Camulodunum's fall, it was already ash and smoke. A colony destroyed, its citizens dead, and the flame of rebellion rising higher. Boudica didn't stay to celebrate. There was no time. She knew Rome would respond, and hard, so she pressed on, knowing that each victory brought her momentum. Her next destination was a city larger, richer, and even more vulnerable Londinium. Londinium was the crown jewel of Roman Britannia. Established just 17 years earlier, it had quickly become a bustling centre of trade and administration. Merchants from all over the empire filled its markets. Officials conducted imperial business under tiled roofs, and wealth flowed through its streets. But as Boudica's army drew nearer, that wealth turned into panic. Governor Suetonius, having rushed back from Wales with a small force, arrived just ahead of the rebellion. He looked at Londinium, crowded, sprawling, and defenceless, and made a brutal decision. He abandoned it. The Roman legions stationed elsewhere were too far to help, and Suetonius couldn't risk his limited troops in a city that couldn't be defended. So he withdrew, taking with him those who could flee. He left behind the old, the sick, the stubborn, and those too slow to believe a woman-led army could bring down Rome. They would soon learn otherwise. Boudica's forces swept into Londinium like a thunderclap. There were no walls to scale, no gates to breach. The city was open, and she made it bleed. Her warriors tore through the streets with the rage of generations. They didn't loot or occupy, they eradicated. The killing was systematic. Roman citizens were dragged from their homes, entire families were butchered, some were impaled, and others were burned alive in temples. No quarter was given, and no Roman symbol was spared. Villas were torched, warehouses exploded into flame, and the rising smoke could be seen from miles away, curling black against the British sky. This wasn't just a slaughter, it was a statement. The message was clear: Rome is not invincible. Contemporary Roman sources like Tacitus and Cassius Dio estimated that tens of thousands died. Some accounts say the brutality exceeded even what occurred at Camulodunum. To the Romans, this was not just a rebellion, it was an apocalypse. Through it all, Boudica rode at the forefront. She did not hide behind commanders. She led on a chariot, flanked by her daughters, watching as the empire's pride crumbled beneath her. This wasn't senseless violence. To her, it was justice for what Rome had done to her family, her people, her land. And she wasn't finished. Ahead of her stood another Roman centre, Verulamium, and beyond that, Rome's full retaliation. Rome had faced rebellions before and fought wars across continents, but never had it seen anything quite like Boudica. She wasn't a general trained in tactics. She didn't speak Latin, and she didn't wear polished armour. Yet she had burned 2 Roman cities to the ground and butchered thousands, citizens and soldiers alike. Now, as Verulamium, a prosperous Romanized town northwest of Londinium, went up in flames, the empire began to panic. Word of her rampage had reached the Roman Senate. Emperor Nero himself reportedly considered withdrawing entirely from Britannia. Imagine that. An empire that spanned from the deserts of Africa to the mountains of Germany considering retreat because of one woman with a chariot and a cause. That's how much she terrified them. In truth, Boudica's power wasn't just in her army, it was in what she represented. Rome saw itself as unshakable, its cities as eternal, its rule as destiny. But here was a Celtic queen, once beaten and humiliated, now leading a revolt that had reduced entire Roman settlements to ash. Every new city she burned wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological blow. Verulamium suffered the same fate as Camulodunum and Londinium. It was rich Romanized and completely unfortified. Boudica's warriors slaughtered the inhabitants, destroyed temples and levelled Roman infrastructure. Archaeological evidence today still shows a thick layer of ash beneath the modern town, a fire that raged with such intensity it left a scar in the earth. But here was the paradox with each victory. Boudica's war machine grew heavier. Her army swelled, but supply lines thinned. Organization faltered. Drunk with success, some tribes grew careless, and Rome, known for its resilience, was regrouping. Governor Suetonius wasn't idle. He had retreated, yes, but not surrendered. He began gathering reinforcements, pulling battle, hardened legions from across the province. He sought the high ground, studied the terrain, and prepared for one decisive battle. Still, even with Roman strength rebuilding, there was one lingering fear in every soldier's heart. Could they stop her? Because Boudica wasn't just waging war, she was rewriting the story of conquest. And she was proving city after burning city that Rome could bleed and queens could strike back. The final confrontation was coming, and the empire held its breath. The fire had spread as far as it could. Now the storm had to face steel. Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus had chosen his battlefield carefully. He wasn't just any Roman officer, he was a survivor. While Boudica's warriors celebrated their victories, Suetonius was calculating. He selected a narrow defile, a tight space bordered by forest and hills, where Boudica's numerical advantage would count for little. His army was small, maybe 10 Saracens strong, but every man was a trained killer, forged in the discipline of the legions. Boudica's force, on the other hand, was immense. Some sources claim up to 200,000 warriors marched under her banner. But they weren't soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, tribal chiefs, and freedom seekers. Inspired but undisciplined, armed with fury but not formation. They believed numbers would crush Rome like a tide. They were wrong. As Boudica's army approached the battlefield, she delivered one final speech. Standing atop her war chariot, flanked by her daughters, she recounted their suffering. The floggings, the rapes, the stolen lands, the burnt homes. She invoked the goddess Andraste and the spirits of their ancestors, vowing either victory or death. Her warriors roared in response, believing the gods would be on their side. The battle commenced. The Britons charged with primal fury. But Suetonius held his ground. He allowed them to close in, packed tightly in the narrow terrain, before launching a perfectly timed Roman counterattack. Spears flew in tight formation, shields locked, and the short Roman swords, the gladius, cut deeply into the disorganized mass. Wave after wave of Britons crashed into the disciplined Roman line, only to be repelled. The Romans then advanced, step by step, methodically and mercilessly. Behind the Britons, wagons and families who had followed the army, expecting to witness a Roman defeat, became a fatal obstacle. Panic ensued, and the narrow battlefield turned into a slaughterhouse. When the dust settled, tens of thousands of Britons lay dead. The rebellion was shattered. The empire had been tested but not broken. Boudica had given everything to fight Rome, and though she lost the battle, her legacy would echo louder than the clash of swords. Her final fate remains a mystery. Roman historians offer conflicting accounts. Some suggest she took poison to avoid capture, while others say she died quietly from illness. But they all agree that she vanished without a trace. No chained queen was ever paraded through Rome's streets. No public execution, no final humiliation. She simply disappeared like a storm that had burned itself out. In that disappearance, something extraordinary happened. She became more than a queen. She became a myth. Rome, shaken and humiliated by the scale of her rebellion, tried to bury the memory, but it was too late. Boudica had become a name whispered in tribal songs and echoed in sacred groves. To the Britons, she was not a defeated rebel, but a martyr, a goddess of war and vengeance, a mother who had stood against the world's most powerful empire and made it bleed. Even among the Romans, there was a grudging respect. Tacitus, though thoroughly Roman, depicted her not as a barbarian, but as a formidable leader, wronged by imperial arrogance. Cassius Dio wrote of her commanding presence and terrifying speeches. They feared her, but they also admired her resolve. Across the centuries, Boudica's memory refused to fade. She rose again in Victorian statues, in poems by Tennyson, in history books, and in school lessons. She became a symbol of defiance, especially to women who saw in her story an unquenchable fire. Her chariot, with its spiked wheels, became a symbol of resistance. Though her body may be lost to history, her voice endures. It rides with the wind, screams in the fire, and echoes through every soul that has ever stood against oppression, whispering, "I will not kneel." Centuries have passed since Boudica vanished into the mists of history, but her shadow still lingers across the British Isles. Her name is carved into monuments, invoked in political speeches, and felt in the resilient spirit of a land that never truly forgot her. In London, near Westminster Bridge, a bronze statue depicts her standing tall on a war chariot, flanked by her daughters, eyes set on the horizon, wheels raised in defiance. Below her, traffic hums and tourists wander, unaware that they walk in the echoes of her rebellion. But her legacy is more than just statues. It's about what she represents. Boudica became more than the sum of her battles. She became an eternal question posed to every empire, every oppressor, every ruler who forgets the power of the people. What happens when the silenced rise? She was not perfect. Her revolt was marked by bloodshed and massacres. Tens of thousands died at the hands of her warriors. But history is not written by saints. It is carved by those who dare to resist. Resistance, by its nature, is rarely clean. What makes Boudica endure is not just her war against Rome, but the fire she ignited in the human imagination. A woman who lost everything yet stood tall. A queen who refused to be defined by the empire that tried to break her. A mother who turned her grief into a sword. Modern historians continue to debate her exact role, her decisions, her motives. But ask any Briton who Boudica was, and they won't recite footnotes. They'll tell you she was the queen who made Rome bleed. The woman who united tribes that had once warred with each other. The warrior who taught the world that dignity can rise even from devastation. And in that, she becomes more than a historical figure. She becomes a symbol of rebellion, of courage, of the unbreakable will to be free. Because even when Rome rebuilt its cities and redrew its maps, it could not erase her. Her flame still burns. In every fight against tyranny, in every voice that dares to say no, and in every soul that would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. Boudica is gone, but her legend rides forever. In ancient times, illness was not seen as random or merely a result of physical issues like bacteria or viruses. Instead, it was viewed as a sign of a deeper imbalance, a disruption in the harmony between the body, mind, soul, and nature. In Mesopotamia, disease was often considered divine punishment. If someone became ill, it was thought they had offended a god, broken a taboo, or attracted a curse. Diagnosis started with questions about actions and relationships, not just symptoms. Priests and healers worked together, interpreting omens, casting spells, and prescribing rituals along with herbal remedies. In ancient China, the concept of balance was more systematic, based on yin and yang and the 5 elements. Health was seen as a state of equilibrium between opposing forces. Practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine considered factors like the time of day symptoms worsened and accompanying emotions. Healing was holistic, involving herbs, acupuncture, and dietary changes to restore balance. In Greece, Hippocrates rejected the idea of divine punishment for disease, but still viewed health as a state of harmony. His theory of the 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, shaped Western medicine for centuries. Each humour was linked to a temperament and an element, and imbalances were thought to cause both physical symptoms and personality changes. Across different cultures, the common belief was that health meant wholeness, a balance that extended beyond the absence of pain. Whether it was the Ayurvedic concept of doshas in India, or beliefs about spiritual possession in African traditions, ancient healers understood that humans were connected to nature. When treating the sick, they looked for signs of imbalance and believed that healing required addressing both visible and invisible forces. In ancient Egypt, the land of pyramids and pharaohs, medicine was a blend of science and sorcery. Egyptian healers, known as WNWs, were not just doctors. They were sacred intermediaries between the physical body and the divine. Their medical practices were surprisingly advanced, yet deeply intertwined with rituals and magic. Much of our knowledge about their practices comes from texts like the Ebers Papyrus, which dates back to around 1550 BCE. This ancient scroll contains hundreds of remedies for various ailments, from toothaches to tumours. Egyptian doctors performed surgeries, set fractures, treated infections, and drained abscesses using copper tools sterilised by fire. They knew how to check pulses, observe urine and feces for diagnosis, and utilise a wide variety of herbs, many of which are still in use today. However, no treatment began without invoking the gods. Thoth was believed to have gifted humanity with the secrets of healing, while Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and plague, was both feared and revered. She could unleash epidemics or grant recovery. Spells were often recited over patients as herbs were applied, with the belief that words held power and incantations were a form of medicinal sound. Honey was one of their greatest tools, used as an antiseptic long before the understanding of bacteria. Wounds were bandaged with honey, sometimes combined with resin or lint. Garlic and onions were prescribed for heart health, castor oil served as a laxative, and mouldy bread was used as a primitive antibiotic, centuries ahead of its time. Egyptian doctors treated both commoners and royalty, and their skills were respected across borders. Neighbouring civilizations sought out Egyptian physicians for difficult cases, making them early specialists. Some focused on specific areas like the stomach, eyes, or spiritual afflictions. But in all their knowledge, there was no separation between the physical and the sacred. A fever might be caused by the Nile's mosquitoes or an angry ghost. Healing the body meant pleasing the gods, purifying the soul, and restoring divine balance. For ancient Egyptians, a healer's true role was not just to cure illness, but to restore cosmic order. Long before the advent of modern medicine, India had already developed its own comprehensive system of healing. This system, known as Ayurveda, viewed the human body not as a machine, but as a microcosm of the universe. Rooted in the Vedic tradition, Ayurveda is more than just a medical practice. It is a holistic philosophy that emphasizes living in harmony with nature, the seasons, and the spirit. At the core of Ayurveda are the three doshas Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Each dosha represents a unique combination of the five elements: earth, water, fire, air, and ether. Vata governs movement. Pitta controls transformation such as digestion, and Kapha manages structure and stability. Everyone is born with a unique balance of these doshas, and illness occurs when this balance is disrupted by factors such as poor diet, stress, environmental influences, or lifestyle choices. Ancient Ayurvedic texts like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, dating back over 2,000 years, provide detailed guidance not only on herbal remedies, but also on surgery, obstetric, psychology, and medical ethics. Charaka emphasized internal medicine and preventive care, while Sushruta is renowned for his pioneering work in surgery, describing over 300 surgical procedures and more than 120 surgical instruments. One of his most remarkable techniques was rhinoplasty, which involved reconstructing a nose using skin flaps from the cheek or forehead. This was not for cosmetic purposes, but to restore the faces of those mutilated as punishment, centuries before Western medicine developed similar techniques. Ayurveda's strength lies in its holistic approach, which integrates healing of the body, mind, and soul. Treatments include herbal medicine, yoga, breathing exercises, pranayama, oil massages, abhyanga, and meditative fasting. Plants like turmeric, ashwagandha, neem, and tulsi are not just food, but powerful medicines that purify and protect the life force. An Ayurvedic healer might address a fever by adjusting the patient's sleep schedule, examining their emotional health, and cleansing their digestive fire, Agnit. Ayurveda teaches that humans are not separate from nature, we are nature itself. Illness is a call to restore balance with nature. In ancient China, health was understood in terms of energy. The vital force known as Qi, pronounced Che, flowed through all living beings, and maintaining health meant ensuring the free flow of Qi without blockages or excesses. This concept underpins one of the world's oldest continuous medical systems, traditional Chinese medicine, TCM. Ancient Chinese physicians studied the natural world, observing the rhythms of the seasons, the phases of the moon, and the behavior of animals to understand illness. They developed the principles of yin and yang and the five elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Yin and yang represent the balance of opposing yet complementary forces, with yin being cool, dark, passive, and internal, and yang being hot, bright, active, and external. Every aspect of the body, including organs, emotions, and functions, was classified under these forces. Health was seen as a dynamic balance between yin and yang. For example, a fever was an excess of yang, while fatigue indicated a depletion of yin. Diagnosis was an art, relying on sensory observations such as examining the tongue, feeling the pulse, listening to the voice, and asking about dreams, emotions, and bowel movements. To restore health, practitioners used acupuncture to unblock qi, moxibustion to warm and stimulate circulation, cupping, herbal formulas, qigong exercises, and dietary adjustments. The ancient text Huangdi Neijing, or the Yellow Emperor's Inner Canon, compiled around 2,000 years ago, remains the foundation of TCM. It explores the causes, prevention, and lifestyle aspects of diseases, emphasizing that emotions like anger, grief, and fear can disrupt organ function. Healing required balancing both physical and emotional aspects. Chinese medicine recognized that treating the body also meant addressing the environment, the soul, and the unseen energy within. Healers believed that in every heartbeat, Qi was communicating, and their task was to listen and restore balance. In the temples of ancient Greece and the forums of Rome, medicine started to move away from purely divine explanations and towards more rational approaches. However, the body was still viewed as a delicate ecosystem governed by balance and temperament. Central to this view was the theory of the four humours, developed by the Greek physician Hippocrates, and later expanded by Roman doctors like Galen. This theory proposed that the human body was regulated by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was associated with an element: air, water, fire, and earth, and a specific temperament. A healthy person had these fluids in balance, while illness was seen as an imbalance of these humours. For example, a feverish and aggressive patient might have excess yellow bile, indicating a hot and dry imbalance, while a sluggish and pale patient might have too much phlegm, associated with cold and wet conditions. Treatments aim to restore balance through methods like bloodletting, purging, special diets, and baths. The Greeks also emphasized the importance of observation and environment in healing. The Hippocratic Oath, which is still relevant in modern medicine, urged doctors to do no harm, observe patients carefully, and treat the whole person, not just the disease. Healing sanctuaries called Asclepiae, named after the god Asclepius, were scattered across Greece. These were not just hospitals, but spiritual retreats where patients slept in sacred dormitories, hoping for healing dreams. Ritual purification exercise, diet, and prayer were all part of the healing process, blending reason and religion. In Rome, medical practice advanced further with Galen, a Greek physician who treated gladiators and emperors. He conducted dissections on animals to study anatomy, wrote numerous medical texts, and helped standardize the theory of humours throughout the empire. Despite some flaws in his theories, Galen's influence lasted for centuries. Greco-Roman medicine, with its roots in mysticism, began to embrace the idea that the human body, though complex, could be understood and brought back into harmony through reason, ritual, and careful healing practices, not just through divine intervention. Before the advent of written texts and formal medical schools, Indigenous peoples worldwide healed their communities with a deep, inherited knowledge passed down through stories, visions, and direct interaction with the natural world. For these cultures, medicine was not a profession but a way of life, integrated into daily rituals, seasonal cycles, and sacred ceremonies. Among Native American tribes, healers, known as medicine men and women, played a role that extended far beyond physical treatment. They were spiritual guides, storytellers, counselors, and custodians of ancestral wisdom. Illness was viewed as a disruption in a person's relationship with nature, their community, the spirits, or themselves. Healing involved more than just herbs. It required reconnection. Plants were central to this practice. Each tribe, from the Cherokee to the Lakota, had extensive knowledge of the land, knowing which roots to chew for pain, which leaves to brew for fever, and which barks to crush for wounds. Sacred plants like sage, cedar, sweetgrass, and tobacco were used in smudging rituals to purify the body and spirit. Healing was not just about the ingredients, but also about intention, ceremony, and respect. Healers often worked with spiritual forces, conducting rituals like sweat lodges, vision quests, and drumming circles. Illness could result from breaking taboos, spiritual possession, or soul loss, where part of a person's essence fled due to trauma. In such cases, rituals like soul retrieval were performed to call the spirit back through chanting, dancing, or guided trances. This deep reverence for nature is also seen in indigenous traditions worldwide. In the Amazon rainforest, shamans use powerful plant medicines like ayahuasca, a hallucinogenic brew used for healing insights rather than recreation. They believe the plants themselves are teachers that reveal the roots of suffering through visions. In Aboriginal Australia, bush medicine includes herbs, clays, and rituals passed down through the dreamtime, the ancestral era that shapes Indigenous identity. Healing here is about balancing the body, land, ancestors, and song lines. These systems were not written in books, but lived through songs, dances, and landscapes. To Indigenous healers, while modern medicine has its machines and labs, the earth has always been the first pharmacy. Healing is about remembering who we are. Across every ancient civilization, regardless of language, geography, or belief system, one constant remained: the belief that healing required more than herbs and surgery. It required spirit. Whether illness was seen as divine punishment, soul imbalance, or a breach with sacred forces, ancient people believed that true healing began in the unseen world, accessible through ritual. In Mesopotamia, before formal medicine, people turned to exorcists and priests to combat illness, believing diseases were caused by malevolent spirits or offended gods. Clay tablets reveal detailed healing rites, where chants were whispered as poultices were applied, and special figurines were buried beneath houses to ward off sickness. In ancient Egypt, physicians invoked the gods before treatment. Prayers to Thoth, the god of wisdom, or Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and wrath, were common before applying honey to a wound or bandaging a limb. Illness was a cosmic imbalance, and healing meant realigning the patient with Manat, the principle of truth, order, and harmony. In many African traditions, healers called sangomas or inyangas used drumming, dancing, and divination to diagnose and cure. They communicated with ancestors, summoned spirits, and entered trance, like states to navigate the spiritual realm on behalf of their patients. Even in classical Greece, ritual played a significant role. In Asclepiaia, sacred healing temples, patients underwent purification, fasting, and prayer. They slept in encoimateria, dreaming under statues of Asclepius, the god of healing, with their dreams interpreted by temple priests to guide treatment. Ritual provided structure, giving meaning to suffering and a sense of connection and control. It reminded people they were not alone. Today, science studies the placebo effect, the power of belief, and the healing impact of intention. The ancients understood this intuitively. Sometimes, a word spoken in reverence can heal deeper than any physical intervention. Not all wounds are visible, and not all medicine is material. When we think of ancient surgery, we often picture crude tools, trembling hands, and unbearable pain. However, the reality is far more impressive and humane. Across the ancient world, surgery was performed with surprising precision. These early healers lacked anesthesia, X-rays, and antiseptics, but they possessed skill, courage, and a deep understanding of the human body, gained through generations of observation, trial, and often harsh necessity. In India, the Sushruta Samhita, written over 2,000 years ago, detailed more than 300 surgical procedures. Its author, Sushruta, is considered the father of surgery. He described techniques for removing tumours, setting bones, repairing hernias, and even reconstructing noses, which is a form of plastic surgery. His tools were sharp, varied, and carefully categorized, including forceps, scalpels, probes, and needles, many made of iron or stone. Sushruta emphasized hygiene, surgical preparation, and the importance of understanding anatomy through dissection, even if it was often limited to animals. His surgical wisdom spread far beyond India, influencing both Islamic and Western practices centuries later. In ancient Egypt, surgical knowledge was intertwined with ritual. Papyrus texts reveal procedures for stitching wounds, treating dislocated limbs, and draining abscesses. Tools like bronze knives, bone saws, and cauterizing rods have been found in tombs. They even practiced trepanation, which involved cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or treat head injuries. Many skulls show signs of healing, indicating that the patient survived. Trepanation wasn't limited to Egypt. In pre-Columbian Peru, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of trepanned skulls, often from warriors wounded in battle. Some surgeries were remarkably successful, with over 80% of patients surviving in certain regions due to bone regeneration. These early surgeons may have used coca leaves or fermented maize beer to dull pain, along with herbal antiseptics. In the Greco-Roman world, Galen advanced surgical techniques by studying injured gladiators and dissecting animals. His insights into the nervous system and vascular pathways laid the groundwork for later anatomical studies. Roman military surgeons treated wounds on the battlefield efficiently using tourniquets and ligatures. While surgery was always dangerous, it was also highly respected. It was the domain of those brave enough to cut into life itself, hoping to draw health from pain. These surgeons were not butchers, but artists of the blade. Though their knowledge was incomplete, their legacy endures every time a scalpel is raised in healing, not harm. Today, we live in a world of digital diagnostics, robotic surgeries, and genetic mapping. We can scan a body in seconds and send prescriptions across oceans with a tap. Yet, in the quiet corners of modern medicine, the whispers of the ancient world still echo. You can find Ayurveda in yoga studios, Chinese herbal formulas in pharmacy aisles, and indigenous smudging ceremonies held in hospitals to honor patients' traditions. Medical students still take a version of the Hippocratic Oath, pledging to do no harm, just as their Greco-Roman predecessors once did. In operating rooms, we use precision tools that trace their lineage back to Sushruta's iron instruments. Concepts like holistic care, preventative medicine, and mind-body connection, now cornerstones of integrative health, are rooted in the wisdom of ancient civilizations who saw healing not as a task, but as a relationship. Even modern science has come full circle. Research increasingly confirms what the ancients believed, that stress, isolation, and emotional trauma can weaken the immune system, disrupt sleep, and cause physical pain. Meditation, once a spiritual discipline, is now studied for its effects on brain health. Forest bathing, derived from Shinto and indigenous nature practices, is prescribed for anxiety. And the placebo effect, healing powered by belief, continues to puzzle researchers who once dismissed it. It's easy to see ancient medicine as outdated. Superstition, folklore, primitive guesswork. But when we look closer, we see something profound. A worldview that treated illness not just as a broken machine, but as a disruption in being. A signal that something was out of harmony. And that idea still matters because medicine isn't only about treatment. It's about meaning, about comfort, about being seen and understood. The ancients knew this instinctively. Whether they used chants, needles, leaves, or blades, they understood that healing was sacred. Today, as we push further into the future of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and personalized medicine, perhaps we are not leaving the ancient world behind. Perhaps we are returning to it with new tools, but the same human heart. A heart that still longs for balance, for wholeness, for healing, not just of body, but of spirit. Her name drifts through history like a half-remembered melody. Sappho, a poetess from the island of Lesbos, born around 630 BCE, whose voice once stirred the hearts of listeners under starlit skies, and whose words, even in fragments, still echo with longing. Unlike the grand warriors and kings of ancient Greece, Sappho's fame came not from conquest, but from emotion. Her domain was not the battlefield, but the human soul. She wrote of love and jealousy, beauty and despair, joy and yearning. She captured fleeting moments, a glance, a blush, a tremble, and held them in verse like pressed flowers, fragile yet eternal. Very little is known of her life, no portraits, no diaries. What we have are traces, a few lines preserved by ancient scholars, quotes embedded in other works, and the ruins of papyrus scrolls lost to time. And yet these fragments shine. The Greek philosopher Plato called her the 10th muse. Centuries later, poets, translators, and dreamers would seek her, piecing her life together like an unfinished song. Sappho was likely born into a noble family on Lesbos, an island in the northeastern Aegean Sea, a place of music and learning where poetry was woven into the fabric of social life. She may have had siblings, a daughter, and even political enemies, though the records are vague. She lived through exile and unrest, moments of silence and moments of song. Her world was one where most women's voices were confined to the home or stifled altogether. But Sappho defied silence. She stood apart, not with rebellion, but with beauty. She wrote in the Aeolic dialect, in short, vivid lyrics designed to be sung to the lyre. Her style was intimate, rich with imagery. Words like evening star, you bring back all that the shining day has scattered, outlived empires. And then, as quietly as she appeared in the records, she faded. Much of her work is lost, burned, buried, or dismissed. But what remains proves one thing: she didn't need monuments. Her poems were her monument. And today, when we speak of passion in verse, of love without shame, of longing that defies centuries, we are still whispering the name Sappho. To truly understand Sappho, you must first understand Lesbos, the island that nurtured her voice. Lesbos was far from a backwater. It was a thriving centre of art, music, and philosophy in the ancient Greek world. With its fertile valleys, olive groves, and coastal winds scented with salt and flowers, Lesbos was both a physical paradise and a cultural jewel. It had its own unique rhythm, slower and more sensual, deeply rooted in lyric tradition. Here, music was not just decoration, but a form of devotion. The lyre and odes resonated through homes and temples, and poetry was meant to be sung, not merely read. In this world of sound and nature, Sappho's voice emerged. She lived in Mytilene, the bustling heart of the island, where politics and art flourished. The island was home to poets and philosophers, rival factions, and shifting alliances. Sappho herself was exiled at one point, perhaps to Sicily, due to political unrest, but Lesbos always called her back. It was her muse. Lesbos was also a rare space for female community in the ancient world. Aristocratic girls were educated in music, poetry, and ritual. Some scholars believe Sappho led a thiosos, a circle or school where young women learned the art of lyric poetry, dance, and devotion to the goddess Aphrodite. This was not formal education as we know it, but a sacred, creative sisterhood. Here, deep bonds were formed that were emotional, intellectual, and possibly romantic. Sappho wrote directly to these women, not as abstract muses, but as real, living presences in her life. She addressed them by name, mourned their departures, celebrated their beauty, and confessed her love with raw honesty. In one fragment, she writes, "I have not had one word from her. I beg you, bring her back to me." These lines are not from myth or theatre, but from a lived experience, a circle of women singing by lamplight, weaving emotion into song. Though time would later distort her legacy, framing it with scandal or speculation, Lesbos was the soil from which her truth grew. It was not just a location on a map, but a cultural cradle of passion, artistry, and female expression. Sappho did not just live on Lesbos. She became Lesbos, its breath, its heart, its voice. Sappho didn't just write poetry, she created music for the soul. Her verses were never intended for silent reading. In ancient Greece, poetry was a living art form. It was sound, breath, and vibration. Sappho's work was lyric poetry, short and intensely personal, meant to be performed with a lyre, a small stringed instrument held in the lap and plucked gently, while the voice carried the words like a breeze over the sea. This is the essence of lyric poetry, from which the term lyrical originates. Her poetry wasn't epic. It didn't recount long tales of war and gods. Instead, it was intimate, emotional, and immediate. A whisper, a confession, a love letter sung beneath fig trees or in candlelit rooms. Sappho was the undisputed master of this form. Her poems were written in Aeolic Greek, a dialect rich in softness and rhythm. She favoured a metre now known as the Sapphic stanza, which flows with a particular rhythm, 3 long lines followed by a shorter, punchy one, like a sigh at the end of a longing thought. It was subtle and musical, mirroring the rise and fall of breath during a quiet moment between lovers. She would have performed these songs surrounded by women, students, companions, and perhaps even priestesses. These gatherings, which could have been ritualistic or educational, were spaces of freedom where emotion, song, and body were unified. Through these performances, Sappho taught others the art of composition, creating not just poems but a culture. We can only imagine the sound. The soft twang of strings, the clear rise of her voice, the stillness of listeners hanging on each syllable. Many of her poems begin with questions or invocations, like the start of a conversation or a prayer. Come to me now, O golden, throned Aphrodite, and free me from hard care. These poems reached out to the gods and delved into desire, yet they feel surprisingly modern. You could set them to music today, and they would still evoke raw, real emotions. Sappho transformed poetry into song, reminding us that emotion is music and that every heartache, every thrill of touch, or tremble of voice deserves a melody. Her work continues to resonate centuries later. For every one of Sappho's poems that have lived today, there are dozens, hundreds, lost. All that remain are shards of sound and feeling, stand-alone words severed from their original songs, drifting through the ages. Some of them are complete stanzas, some a breath, a mere word, a shard of longing, a closing thought without an opening. And yet even those broken pieces seethe with vitality as embers glowing in the remains of something long lovely. Why did so much get lost? Time, war, and deliberate destruction. Sappho's poems were once compiled into 9 books, kept in the mythic library at Alexandria. These were likely copied and recited throughout the classical world. But when that library was lost, much ancient literature was lost. Later, as Christianity's influence increased, the majority of those works that had been labelled pagan or immoral were suppressed, lost, or burned on purpose. Sappho's poetry, full of passion, especially same-sex passion, made her a casualty. By medieval times she was a spectre. Her name hung in there, but her voice was nearly eradicated. Only in quotes by other authors stored in grammars, commentaries, or philosophical texts did fragments of her poetry endure destruction. Those fragments and shards were most often used for style or phrasing, not emotion. But still the emotions filtered through. And then the papyri. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists, digging up the sands of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, uncovered thousands of fragments of ancient documents, of worn and dried out lines of Sappho, fragments of songs unseen in over 1,000 years. More findings ensued. In 2004, almost intact poetry was found on a papyrus wrapped around a mummy in Germany. Each finding was akin to resurrection. And yet so much is gone. We read her today in traces. What we are left wanting is not just what she wrote, but what she might have said if history allowed her to speak without needing to be cut off. Still, there is something hauntingly right about this survival in fragments. Sappho wrote of transience, of fleeting things, of beauty between the fingers, such as sand. And so, perhaps it is right that her poetry exists for us not as monument, but as mystery, puzzle pieced together by those who adore words, adore sound, adore heart. A voice once drowned in fire still smouldering. Sappho's poetry had been too honest to go unavenged. In her lifetime, she was admired, even doted on as a mistress of lyric poetry. She was called the 10th muse by Plato and placed alongside the gods. But as the centuries passed and civilizations shifted, her reputation was manipulated, lost, or tarnished depending on the time period. Why? Because she wrote of love and not the kind history was happy to remember. Much of her poetry is about passionate love and desire for women. She was a fan of their beauty, mourned their loss, confessed jealousy, and celebrated their closeness. This was not unusual in her world. In the cultural scene of Lesbos, especially among the aristocratic class, passionate, emotional, and maybe erotic bonds were accepted, even admired. But later generations, especially under Roman, Christian, and Victorian morality, were having trouble with this. Instead of facing her reality, they redefined her history. Medieval copyists overlooked a woman. Renaissance translators watered down a woman. Victorians proclaimed her a tragic love sick over a man, even fabricating the legend that a woman jumped off a cliff over her love of a ferryman named Phaon, a story that nowhere appears in her actual work. This invented story did something to erase her queerness, to make her pain acceptable, her desires normal. Some condemned her poetry as only didactic or platonic. Others outright dismissed her as obscene, and yet she persisted. Even in scandal, Sappho's name persisted. In the 19th century, when free speech on same-sex love was still taboo, her reputation slipped quietly into a coded lexicon of queer identity. The words sapphic and lesbian became synonymous with romantic love between women, the direct reference drawing on her name and home. She was, unwittingly, made a symbol of defiance, a poetic precursor to those whose passions were being erased. And even now, debates continue to echo. What was she? A teacher, a lover, a myth, a threat? Maybe, though, the question to be asked is why we remain so afraid of her truth. Sappho did not write to fit in. She wrote as she felt. She named beauty, confessed longing, and lived by verse. Her scandal was not in her actions. It was in her honesty. She had the strength to write desire, and because of that, history tried to muffle her voice, but never succeeded. If there was a single deity hovering over Sappho's life and work, it was Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and unending want. Aphrodite was no mere myth to Sappho. She was a muse, a friend, even a sort of companion in moments of ardor and despair. The majority of Sappho's most powerful lines are not necessarily about love. They are entreaties to Aphrodite, prayers, pleas, reasons voiced in verse when the ache of longing was too much to bear. In her most famous extant poem, Ode to Aphrodite, Sappho is not merely celebrating the goddess. She speaks directly to her in the voice of a familiar who's heard it all before. Come to me now. If ever you have responded to my voice before, set me free from hard care. Do all that my heart longs to do. It is not shame in the exposure, no fear of expressing desire. Sappho's love is never sinful or weak. It is holy, something sacred enough to entice a goddess from heaven. In ancient times, Aphrodite was not just romance. She was the queen of attraction, of seduction, of sexual attraction between bodies, of separation pain. To call her forth was to affirm that love had the power to hurt as well as to thrill. Sappho was that ambivalence. She did not romanticize love. She lived with its contradictions. She wrote about its sweetness and its sting, its beauty and its cruelty. In another poem, she states, "Love shook my soul like the wind on the mountain, troubling the oak trees." In this one, love is rough. It's savage, primitive, something that tears apart the self without even a by your leave. In placing Aphrodite at the centre of her emotional world, Sappho made yearning mythic. Her poetry dissolved the border between the personal and the divine, between everyday feeling and heavenly power. And in doing so, she helped to produce a literary tradition where love was not just a theme. It was worship. To Sappho, Aphrodite was never an abstraction. She was a reflection, an authority that repaid in kind all the passion, the doubt, and the beauty of human hearts. And in every line of Sappho's verse, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, listens and replays. Just so with her verse, Sappho's death remains a mystery wrapped in myth. Nobody can really report when she died, how old she was, or even where she spent her final years. She died quietly on Lesbos, surrounded by the sea and music she loved, according to some. Others, especially later Roman authors, spun tragic myths that she leaped from Lephida's white cliffs for sorrow at losing an unrequited love for handsome boatman Phaon. But there is no evidence of that story in the past. It rather seems to be an invention, a way in which a male literary heritage reworded her pain and passion as a hetero tragedy. It turned a strong female poetic voice who loved women into a victim of unrequited love from a man. A neat ending, perhaps, but a false one. The truth is simpler and greater. Sappho disappeared as quietly as she appeared. After death, her work endured for centuries. She was read by philosophers, paraphrased by dramatists, and performed to singing during performances all over the ancient Greek world. Her poems were preserved in 9 books, a treasure trove of lyric poetry. Her fame briefly rivaled Homer's, but the past is unforgiving to voices that disturb its conventions. With the rise of the Roman Empire and subsequent Christian hegemony, Sappho's unashamedly erotic and passionate verses, especially those where she extolled love between women, fell out of favour. Her writing was no longer duplicated. Her manuscripts allowed to rot on shelves that would eventually burn or decay. Some believe that her books were actively destroyed by early Christian churchmen who identified her songs as dangerous. By the Middle Ages, her name was forgotten, but her words were all but lost. More than 1,000 years would pass before pieces of her poetry reappeared, unearthed from Egyptian rubbish dumps or transcribed into ancient grammars. She was reborn bit by bit, not in legend, but in endurance. Her death can be forgotten, but her disappearance was never total. She lingers in whispers, in stolen lines scribbled in the margins, in the nagging H of silenced voices. Sappho did not need to die heroically. Her poems were already timeless, and in the vacancies where her words had lived, we might yet feel the shape of her spirit, yearning unfinished, but never truly lost. Sappho's existence can be lost to obscurity, her poetry here and there and in bits, yet never has her presence ever ceased to be felt. In fact, it has only grown stronger, like a candle that burns but will not be extinguished. With every generation, someone has rediscovered her. During the Renaissance, students learned bits of hers, amazed by her delicate command of emotion. During the Romantic era, poets like Byron and Shelley spoke of her name. During the 19th and 20th centuries, when gender and identity discussions began to come alive again, Sappho emerged as an icon of queer resilience, of women's creativity, of emotional freedom. Her name still lingers in words themselves. Sapphic was employed to describe erotic love between women. Lesbian took from the island she came from now a global tag. They are not tags. They are echoes of her presence. Proof that a voice can cross millennia and shape the way we feel about love and expression. Artists, writers, and musicians continue to return to her. Painters have seen her in the lyre under the moonlight. Poets have retranslated her over and over again, each trying the beat beneath the words. Modern writers have imagined, reclaimed, called back to life in novels, songs, and plays. And through it all, one thing is sure. Sappho writes to something universal. It does not matter that her poetry is broken. It does not matter that her life tale is smudged. What matters is the emotion that smoulders beneath the words. The tremulous ecstasy of yearning, the agony of distance, the divinity of beauty. These are emotions we all share. She merely learned to sing them. Perhaps that's her true immortality. Not the marble statues or the scholarly footnotes, but the way a few lines from over 2,000 years ago can still make someone pause, breathe, and feel less alone. Sappho's gift was never just poetry. It was presence. She made feeling an art. She made longing a form of truth. And in doing so, she became more than a poet. She is a mirror to everyone who has ever loved tenderly, deeply, or in defiance of the world. And as long as human hearts break and heal with words, Sappho will endure. Not just remembered, but felt.